Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Maine. We're holding our second, really what we call urgent or emergency webinar on the situation in Ukraine. And I want to say the evening is quite solemn. I just finished watching some of the CBS evening news. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, it's rather distressing. Really, it's quite unbelievable. A war has broken out in Europe. And I was in a little dust up in the Balkans in the 90s, but this is really different. This is a great power attacking another country. And I think the situation is stunning and alarming. It's certainly something I never expected to see after so many decades of living in a sort of a rules-based order. And it wasn't perfect by any means, but there were some rules. In the words of the late Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the UN, that order saved us from hell. And as the terrible images coming out of Ukraine make all too clear, war is hell. It's too early to tell where this crisis will go and when or how it will end. All we know is that its impact on the architecture of international peace and security will be substantial. And I would add to that, the impact on us here in Maine is going to be substantial as well. We can all feel what's happening over in Europe right now. Of course, a significant part of that architecture has been NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance of 30 independent member states charged with the enormous task of safeguarding each other's freedom and security through political and military means. NATO has been the principal security instrument of the free world since 1949, and is very much at the center of the current conflict, even as its forces are remaining on the sidelines, but ready to come to the aid of any member states should their territory come under attack. And on this solemn night, we are fortunate to have two very distinguished gentlemen with a lifetime of service to the United States and with significant experience with NATO at the highest levels. So this is a very special webinar for us. Our speakers tonight are Admiral Gregory G. Johnson, who is first and foremost, of course, we think this is the most wonderful of his bio, is that he is an advisory trustee of the World Affairs Council of Maine, and Ambassador John M. Koenig, who, like many of our distinguished speakers, comes to us through our own ambassador, Judith Fergan, who is so good at finding outstanding speakers for us. And thank you, Judith, for doing that. And let me give you a little sense of the credentials of our two speakers. Admiral Johnson, that is 4-star Admiral Johnson, is a former commander of U.S. Naval Forces in Europe, Naval Forces Africa, and Commander-in-Chief of the Allied NATO Forces Southern Europe. Admiral Johnson had a 36-year career in the Navy and has been responsible for NATO operations across the globe. His NATO duties included operational level command of peace support operations in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo, as well as NATO missions in Macedonia, Albania, and other southeastern European nations. He successfully oversaw NATO's Operation Active Endeavor, assumed command of the NATO Response Force at the Istanbul Summit in June 2004, and established NATO's training support mission in Iraq. He was also assigned to several senior policy positions in Washington, most notably serving as the executive assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1992 to 1993, and military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, 1999 to 2000. Our other guest, equally distinguished, is John M. Koenig, who also had a 30-plus year career of service in the U.S. Foreign Service. He was ambassador to Cyprus from 2012 to 2015. He was deputy U.S. permanent representative to NATO in Brussels from 2003 to 2006. As the alliance took on the stabilization mission in Afghanistan, opened partnerships with Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries, and took in 7 new members in Central and Eastern Europe into the alliance. Koenig later served as the political advisor to the Allied Joint Forces Command in Naples, 2009 to 2012, And during NATO's Libya bombing campaign and the drawdown, and this was during the bombing campaign over Libya and the drawdown of operations in the Balkans. From 2006 to 2009, he was Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires in Berlin, working to reinvigorate strategic ties with Germany and with Europe. Decades earlier, near the end of the Cold War, Ambassador Koenig had been a political officer at the American Embassy in East Germany, which I think is fascinating. Since 2017, Ambassador Koenig has taught at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. This is since 2017. And before I hand things off to our Executive Director, Allison Hodgkins, who will be moderating for us this evening, I want to briefly thank our sponsors for supporting this program and other programs that we have. And also to Alan Wardell at the University of Southern Maine for quite literally making these programs happen. And as always, our audience for being here. We look forward to your questions, and you can submit them via the Q&A or the chat box at any time. Allison, I'm turning this over to you.
Thank you, Bill. And Admiral Johnson, Ambassador Koenig, thank you both for being here this evening. I want to start by asking both of you to do some reflecting, some backward looking to the periods when you were both involved in NATO. And I'm asking this because we keep hearing on all the chat shows that the current conflict in Ukraine has brought NATO full circle. So it went from, in 1949, being an alliance of 12 states coming together to defend themselves from a threat coming out of Moscow. And now in 2022, we have 30 states allied together to protect themselves from a threat coming out of Moscow. And I want you to think about that, because when you guys were working with NATO, when you were representing the U.S. there, you were on that outward curve at a time in which the threat wasn't, there was no Soviet Union. The threat wasn't necessarily coming from Moscow. It wasn't necessarily conventional threats. In fact, sometimes it most certainly wasn't conventional threats. And we weren't even talking about states. And what I'd like both of you to reflect on is how the work that you were doing fit in with that core mission of NATO, which is to defend Europe, the North Atlantic states, and really to protect freedom and democracy across the world, or specifically in Europe and the North Atlantic, and how your experiences during that time, what you saw, have shaped what NATO is today. And I'm going to start with you, Admiral Johnson, because I'm going to go chronologically. Could you weigh in on this for us, please?
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I would like to thank Bill for his introduction, Allison for everything you do every day, and the energy you put into the World Affairs Council of Maine. I also would just like to say how humbled I am by the extreme courage displayed each and every day by our 44 million Ukrainian friends. And I'm also very inspired by the incredible leadership of their president, President Zelensky. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that at the very beginning. I'm a serious, I guess, if there's such a thing as a serious or a addicted NATO-phile. I have a huge admiration for NATO as an institution, have always admired it, was so delighted in my career as I got more into the policy side to spend an awful lot of time in NATO and in Brussels and in Mons and what have you. I think it's been one of the greatest success stories in all of recorded history in terms of collective security. It doesn't mean that we've made mistakes, haven't made mistakes, and that hopefully we won't make any more in the future as serious as some of the ones I think we made in the late 90s and maybe in the early 2000s. You know, we were created as a beast from the Cold War to counter a very specific and agreed upon threat by all members of the alliance. And then when that threat went away, we became a little bit confused, I think. And Partnership for Peace was fine. And at least in the early stages in 2004, when we brought 3 former Warsaw Pact countries in, and then we brought 7 more in, 2007. But there's another side to the story, and there are those, and I'm sure they aren't going to be any "I told you so," but there are those who warned us about this. And so for the sake of argument, let's just take someone who's in the press, and that would be Tom Friedman. He was very vocal about the mistake of going too far, and that, the other people have red lines just like we have red lines. And I think that was what has happened to us there. We got tied up in counterterrorism operations. The NATO alliance adapted, which was very important, and was very supportive of the U.S. efforts in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. But you could argue about the efficacy of that effort. And all of them supported us at some great political cost domestically, to many of them, and yet they supported us. But we also withdrew our forces from Europe. We had over 350,000 through up into the early till Vietnam time. Then it got down to about 300,000, and then it precipitously dropped to 100,000 by the turn of the millennium, and we got down to about 60,000. We didn't have a credible deterrent any longer, and we kind of forgot about that and didn't think we needed it. But we did have a seething of foe on the other side of the line who didn't forget the hubris that we displayed at the end of the Cold War. And now we're dealing with that. And because we didn't have a credible deterrent, and we didn't, he actually did. Right now, he's out deterred us. And what's the term in deterrent strategy? He got to play his card, and we had to scramble, and we got ourselves in a box canyon, which is where we are now, where we can either do our best to try to help without getting into a confrontation, and we'll be talking about that more. So I do believe that NATO has endured, and we would not have been able to respond in the way that we finally did within the last month had we not had it. If we'd have had to start from scratch, just say like we had to do for Desert Shield and Desert Storm, where Secretary Baker and President Bush took 6 months to pull together some kind of an ad hoc coalition. So this was profoundly important. And let's hope we've learned a lesson and don't lose track of what we're really about.
Thank you, Admiral. Ambassador Koenig, you want to weigh in here?
Of course. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Allison and Bill, and the World Affairs Council, and also sort of echo what Admiral Johnson said about Ukrainians and President Zelensky. Their courage and resilience is really remarkable, and I think it has moved everyone around the world, especially people I know here in Washington State and the United States. I'd like to actually begin my experience by just noting that I was posted in East Berlin during the Cold War, which I think has colored my perception of everything ever since. In 2 different ways. One was the awesome quality of the Cold War, which is forgotten. The fearsome quality of the Cold War. It was when you saw it up close in a place like East Germany, or the dividing line between Germany, West Germany and East Germany. It was startlingly bold, direct. But the other thing was that it also, serving in East Berlin, taught me that people served on both sides of the Iron Curtain. People lived on both sides of the Iron Curtain. That was something that we must not lose sight of as well. So we can try to understand our opponents, and I think that's one thing that recent experience has taught us has great value. I just as Admiral Johnson did, I spent a lot of my time in NATO, working while we were conducting peace support operations in the Balkans or in Afghanistan. We had a counterterrorism mission that we took on. We did, I think, lose our way a bit. The threat perception within the alliance was hard to solidify during these years because the perception of these threats was not at all the same across NATO allies. We also, of course, drew down forces, as the Admiral noted. We kind of, while hardly thinking, brought in additional allies, especially after the first 3. The first 3 we thought a lot about, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. We had a debate before that happened. We thought about it very deliberately. And after that, we never thought about it again, to be honest, until the issue of Ukraine and Georgia came up. So when I was at NATO, we brought in 7 additional allies. They changed our perception of Russia, and that is a problem. We lost, in a way, a strategic perception of Russia, and we adopted a Central European or Eastern European view of Russia, in my view. And that, I think, became costly for us in the long run. And I think we still need to guard against it somewhat today. Anyway, I think NATO has now returned to its collective defense roots. I think this is not only about the territorial defense of Europe from a threat from Russia, which is very, very high on our agenda right now. It's also about things like cyber defense. It's about all of the threats that are directly focused on this territory of Europe, whether they're in the cyber domain or in the physical domain. And you know, this is, I think, going to ensure that NATO remains relevant and focus for transatlantic security for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. So you both mentioned the subject of NATO's enlargement, and this is also something, every discussion that we have about this topic, there's this straight line between the enlargement of NATO not necessarily encouraging, but sort of making it clear that they're open to Ukraine becoming a member, and Putin's decision to invade. And certainly there are discussions about what will happen, but Ukraine's membership in NATO, to my understanding, has not yet been taken off the table or not taken off the table. And there's discussion of Finland and Norway potentially joining. Ambassador Koenig, I'd like to start with you. What has been the impact of this enlargement? And particularly now, the fact that we're still talking about NATO enlargement on Putin's thinking, on the chances for escalation, and how we may ultimately back our way out of this crisis.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I am a person who shares the realist, what's typically called the realist criticism of NATO enlargement, that it was perhaps on balance a bad idea, and that we recognized that back in the late 1990s. That is a debate that, of course, is now mainly historical. And I do want to make sure that we adhere to our commitments to our current allies. And I think we've made that very clear. But let's think a little bit about how enlargement changed NATO. And I will emphasize once again, it changed the perspective inside NATO. I was there, I heard these discussions, including those involving the United States. And we never really challenged the views that were brought in mainly by Poles and early on the Czechs that were intensely focused on the threat emanating from Russia. At that time, we didn't think there was really a threat, but they were focused on it for natural historical reasons. And we actually tended to promote their views against allies who we regard as too conciliatory toward Moscow, especially France and Germany. And this occurred against the background of our decision to invade Iraq, where relations with France and Germany were seriously poisoned by that event. So we kind of took sides in NATO, and we kind of helped to split NATO over the Iraq war and then over the attitude toward Russia. And this persisted for quite a while. So I'm not saying that we were terribly split, but we were affected very much by our choice of one side in this discussion. And we sort of abandoned our overall strategic perspective because, as we kind of made clear in what we did there, we didn't think NATO was particularly relevant for European security by this time. So that, I think, was a mistake. The debate was revived a lot around the time that NATO told the world that Ukraine and Georgia would be members of the alliance. You say that we didn't actually consider it, but we did consider it in 2008, and we came up with a kind of slapdash compromise answer to the question, which I think everybody immediately recognized was disastrous, but which we can't let go of because we had decided it at a summit. This is very bad in terms of NATO form, if you ask me. We should have addressed that earlier. So now we're left with what is an empty promise that NATO and that Ukraine and Georgia will someday be members of the alliance. We gave them no path to membership at the time. We made that declaration in April of 2008. In August of 2008, Vladimir Putin and Russia invaded Georgia. We really ought to have paid a lot more attention. I was in Munich at the security conference when Putin threw down the gauntlet to NATO in 2007. And we kind of clutched our pearls and said, this is totally inappropriate, and didn't actually react substantively. In fact, we decided to carry on. He was a blustering, emerging autocrat who really was not a threat. And we decided to just press ahead. I think this was a huge mistake, but it doesn't really answer the question of what we do today. I think what we do have to recognize, however, is that NATO enlargement has come to an end. The Cold War, to sort of paraphrase a famous realist, I don't think Ukraine is necessarily worth the life of one Washingtonian grenadier. And I think we need to start considering what is the new security architecture of Europe going to be in the aftermath of this catastrophic war, even though it's early days and this war could go on for quite a few more months. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. And Owen Trailer has nicely pointed out, I misspoke. Of course, Norway was a founding member of NATO. I meant Sweden and Finland. It's late in the evening here in Maine. Admiral Johnson, we've heard from Ambassador Koenig sort of the political side and how the member states were thinking about Russia and all of these questions. What did it look like on the operational side as NATO got larger? This split that Ambassador Koenig was talking about, did that have any impact in terms of how these different forces work together? What was it like on your end?
Well, I do believe that it had an impact. I think it was more at the political level, though. At the military level, we managed to get along and patch things up, and you know, we still to this day. I mean, until we left Iraq recently, and then this year left Afghanistan, we had NATO forces with us, and so we did a remarkable job, I think, in that regard. But there was a lot of strategic drift, and we did it because we were allies, and there was some threat out there. It wasn't existential, but it was a threat, and we got focused on it. I'll come back to it a little bit, and I don't want to rehash it, but it makes me feel better if I do. You know, the big 2007 and 2008 were really big years here, and Munich Security Conference in February of 2007, everybody listened to this tirade from the president of Russia, who was about to leave office. And that was his swan song. It was the last time he's ever been seen in Munich, I think. You know, and then a year later, or 14 months later, I think it was April of 2008, there's a NATO defense ministerial, or it was a full-on ministerial heads of state. Anyway, that's where they offered up the possibility of membership to Ukraine and Georgia. And by August of that year, Mr. Putin was perched in Georgia. He told us all of this 1 year earlier, or 18 months earlier, and he did it, but we didn't pay any attention. And so I think that was a huge, huge mistake. And then, of course, Crimea 2013, and he watched us, you know, red lines in Syria, which when we got up to the red line, we stepped back and didn't do it. We let him in 2015, back into the Middle East. He came in the Donbass and Crimea in 2014. We had the years of the last administration where NATO didn't matter. We did everything we could to harm it. And he just didn't think we were paying attention and were that interested. And by then, because of the drawdown on our forces, we didn't have a credible deterrent force. We didn't even realize we didn't have a credible deterrent force. I don't know if we really woke up to that until the last month. And we still don't. So he still has escalation dominance over us in terms of a large force, and we don't have a credible force in place. And that's why we have to be very careful in what we do. And but even if it wasn't for that, we'd still have to be very careful, because whatever you think, they have more nuclear weapons than any other place on Earth, and they are a large, important, significant nation, and no one likes to be disrespected, and particularly our Russian friends. And so it's going to be very difficult now with what we've got ourselves into, and find a de-escalatory path. And we'll be talking about that later. But I do, again, I said in my opening remarks, we got a little bit led astray and we lost sight, and he didn't. He spent 20 years building up his forces. Now it remains to be seen how effective they really are. A lot of what's happened has called it into question, and we can talk about that later. But I agree with John completely that we made some serious mistakes. These were strategic level mistakes, heart and soul of what the alliance was about in the particularly from 2008 on. I think if we'd have just done the 7 in 2007 and then started to show some respect and tried to find ways to be more inclusive. We had Medvedev came in, there was a little bit of glimmer there, but then Putin came back, and we've lost it since then. So it's going to be much more difficult, but I'm hopeful that we'll find a way.
I don't know if I want to thank you for that sort of sobering assessment of where things are right now. But you both have been quite clear in pointing out the strategic level mistake in terms of the enlargement, and citing how that impacted Russia and how Russia reacted to it and what it meant in terms of the credibility of our deterrent. But I want to ask you, given that enlargement is clearly problematic and we're seeing the consequences of that right now, what is the obligation of NATO? I mean, NATO is this organization that is supposed to be defending the free world. It's supposed to be protecting states that have made that decision to become democracies, which is, a long and difficult process to become free market, to engage in the free market system. What then, if we're not going to have enlargement, is NATO's obligation to countries like Ukraine? Do we just sort of let them have their go through regime change? Do we support them? What do we say to that criticism, which was behind a lot of the support for the enlargement? And again, I'll go back to Ambassador Koenig to get the political side of the Clausewitzian trinity there.
Thanks, Allison. I think we need to consider what are our obligations in NATO and what are our sort of policy priorities as NATO. Our obligations in NATO with regard to the defense of partners are zero, apart from anything that we collectively decide they are. So we care about our partners. We engage in them across a wide range of joint activities, and we base our partnership on common interests. So it's not as though we don't share anything with them. But I think it's critically important for NATO, especially at a time like this, that we be 100% clear that Article 5 applies to NATO allies and only NATO allies. And the basic purpose of NATO is to defend the alliance. It is not to advance the cause of freedom in the world or any of these other things. It is to protect the alliance. That is one thing that we all can agree on 100%. And any doubt about that is a huge problem, as we saw chiefly during the last American administration, which had a big problem with affirming that. So I think we're in pretty solid ground on that. We can undertake other obligations. But those would need to be agreed, and some kinds of obligations, like defense obligations, so going to war, have high requirements in several of the NATO countries. Germany, for example, would need to have a parliamentary decision to support many of the things that we're talking about doing. So Germany has come out of with a new approach to European security in the last several weeks, that Germany and some other allies have high constitutional requirements for engaging in conflict. So I think it's best to just look at NATO as a collective security alliance, and that is where we that's where we will either succeed or fail.
Thank you. So Admiral Johnson, I want to shift now to what's happening on the ground from the military perspective, because, you know, as Ambassador Koenig made very clear, militarily speaking, Article 5 is very clear, but NATO is offering, or individual NATO countries are offering support to Ukraine. Short of direct military involvement, are the various things that NATO countries are doing militarily sufficient? If it's not sufficient, what else should be done? And what are the risks of doing even the basic things that we are doing? Whether it's supplying weapons or training or all of that stuff. Go ahead, sir.
Well, there's nothing that's risk-free, so there's always risk. But I think the things that we're doing now is more than the letter of the law requires, but it's a moral obligation. It's under the UN Charter, everybody has the right of self-determination, Article 1, which I strongly believe in. And so I think what we're doing now is fine, and we ought to keep doing it as long as we can possibly do it. And I certainly don't, I can certainly understand the disappointment of Ukraine, but we have no obligation to do that, nor do I think it would be wise to do it. I have no doubt that we would be in some kind of, I don't know what exactly it would look like, but it would be a World War III-like thing. And they have escalation dominance right now. We don't have the force in place that we had during the Cold War. And again, like John said, I don't know if I don't think we could get NATO agreement to do it anyway. In fact, I'm pretty sure we couldn't. And so we wouldn't be able to do it anyway. And that would just create fissures and disagreements within the alliance now. And it's come together and it's very unified, and we wouldn't want to do things that would risk that. So I think we keep on doing it. There's many other things as you read all the stuff that we get every morning. I do think, you know, a future possibility, and this may be off the page, I agree with John that the idea of NATO membership is, will never, it's hard to imagine that could ever happen. I do believe that, you know, some kind of reconstruction, if we can come to a point where Ukraine is still a sovereign state, a coherent sovereign state, and has been able to, through self-determination, have its own government in place, obviously not a puppet state of Russia, that we can provide all manner of economic, a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, all kinds of different things. I don't think it's beyond the realm even, although I don't think it'll happen, but it would be much more realistic if you wanted them to join for them to join the EU, because that's an economic organization, it's not a security organization, but I don't think that's a possibility either. But there's an immense amount of stuff that we can do. And another thing we could do also, just to buttress our own defensive posture, is pass a defense budget within our own country. That might be a good thing to do. And I think more importantly, and I would like to think that it's already going on, and this is in the diplomats' corner, but I can't help but believe we haven't begun or are working desperately to try to create some kind of back channel communications or private communications. There's, you know, China, Israel, there's potential people out there. There must be something going on because we desperately need to be communicating. And a private channel, and this may sound off the wall too, but I can't say that I've been a fan of what he's done since the day he left the Chancellor's office, but Mr. Schroeder might be a private channel in a very serious and important diplomatic mission. So there are things that we need to be doing and we ought to do, because we're going to have to create. And if we're serious about helping them, we're going to have to create some kind of off-ramp that's going to be palatable to Mr. Putin. And it's going to take some real skilled diplomacy, imaginative diplomacy, and a lot of hard work. And most importantly, it's going to take absolute ironclad unity among all 30 nations and holding them all together. So that's going to be a job for John's team. I call it the East Bank of the Potomac as opposed to the West Bank of the Potomac.
So I'd like to hear from the East Bank of the Potomac River on what Admiral Johnson has just said. Sir, Ambassador Koenig? care to
Absolutely.
respond?
I actually agree with Admiral Johnson, with Grog. I think that some of this is probably going on already. We saw that Naftali Bennett made a visit to Moscow, had a 3-hour meeting with Vladimir Putin, and he has remained in touch with Putin as well as with Zelensky, with President Biden, I believe, and with Macron and others, Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, after that. So that's one channel, and relations between Israel and Russia are perhaps sufficiently positive and trusting to enable Naftali Bennett to do this. Tomorrow, another country which has sort of straddled the gap between the West and Moscow, Turkey, is going to host a meeting between the Koluba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, and the Russian foreign minister, and I think the Turkish foreign minister, Çavuşoğlu. And that's another opportunity for this discussion. And we have a hard time ourselves trusting the Turkish government at this time, but this is a role that Turkey seems to have positioned itself to play. First of all, Turkey wants more than most other neighboring countries, I think, to see just an end to this conflict because of the difficulty that it causes for Turkey. It has some of the same special interests as Russia with regard to the Black Sea. It wants to control the Black Sea. In fact, there used to be a kind of condominium between Russia or the Soviet Union and Turkey in the Black Sea. Finally, it has shown a bit of panache at organizing diplomatic meetings. They have been good at this. Even when our relations have been bad, they've been good at it. So this may be another opportunity. And I would hope that other contacts are underway. I'll just make one last pitch for a person from the East Bank of the Potomac. Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, is a former ambassador to Moscow and also a former deputy secretary, and a person who really understands Russia, I think probably as well as anyone. I thought his testimony yesterday was fascinating because even though it's been characterized in some ways by the media, he in fact was much more sober and balanced, I think, than the media reporting tended to say. I would hope, given his huge role in brokering the Iran nuclear deal, that perhaps he could come out of sort of Langley and do this a little bit more on behalf of the United States. I know he visited Moscow to try to make an impression on Putin, evidently with some of the intelligence information that we had that was supposed to try to dissuade or deter Putin from invading Ukraine.
Thank you. The Turkish angle is very interesting, and when you said about them having the panache, of course, that goes all the way back to the Ottoman Empire with how the emissaries were brought in. You've also just raised something really interesting that ran through my mind, is what the possible Israel-Turkey channel is going to have on relations between those two countries. Certainly Naftali Bennett and Tayyip Erdogan are not friends, and there's some tension there. So that will be interesting. But I want to, before we go to audience questions, I want to come back to this question of a credible deterrent. And Admiral Johnson, you said you don't think we have a credible deterrent, and you're kind of echoing what French President Emmanuel Macron said in 2019 about NATO being brain dead and not having any more real deterrent capacity, and the need for Europe to kind of stand alone. Now, what we've seen, and what I've also been reading and hearing in all the talking head places, is that this tremendous display of NATO unity has changed the equation. So what is the role of this? Has NATO restored any of that, maybe just on a political level? And how might this incredible display of unity impact not just Putin's thinking, but Xi Jinping in terms of what's going on in the South China Sea? I'll start with Admiral Johnson and then come back to Ambassador Koenig. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Great question. And I think it's had a very, very positive impact. Just the fact that 30 nations in a heartbeat came together. I consider the moment was the Saturday of the Munich conference when President Zelensky spoke and reminded the assembled multitude that whatever it was, 80 something years ago, there was a Munich conference in 1938. We got peace in our time out of that. It lasted about a year, with horrific results. And he reminded the people in 2022 of that. So I think this has focused people's attention. Again, I'm amazed that it within a week, and look what the next Sunday, that was on a Saturday, 8 days later, the chancellor was meeting and what Germany did, and ramping $100 billion just like that. And they're going to start spending on defense. It focused everybody's attention. So I think our deterrent has significantly improved. I just think that we can't just do it with rotational battalions and companies that aren't in coherent fighting units. And they have to be stationed there. It doesn't have to go back to the Cold War, 300,000, 350,000, just US plus the British and French and everything else. It's a huge amount of force. I don't think it calls for a return to that. I think it calls for something much more reasonable. And one would hope, in addition to that, somehow we figure out, it begins with some kind of back channel communications that can grow into a positive way. It's going to take years to build a level of trust where we can have anything meaningful. But we need to be very careful how we do reinstitute that deterrence, because we do have a wounded bear, and he kind of backed us into a corner. We responded. I think we responded just about at the maximum extent of what is prudent, and we ought to hold it and then see how we can help him. And unfortunately, the poor Ukrainians are suffering through all of this because we allowed that to happen. We didn't listen to what was going on all during the last 15 years. And he never heard yet in anything that he did. And so he just kept on going. And he's a pretty good poker player. So let's hope that every day that they hold out, actually it calls into question his current escalatory dominance. Is it really a Potemkin military? Maybe there's cyber stuff going on we don't know about. Maybe a C4I has been destroyed. I don't know what's happened. Why is that convoy sitting on that road for coming on a week now? It mystifies me. And so there's a lot to learn, and hopefully in the coming days and weeks, that'll become more evident, and it'll become more evident in ways that preserve the sovereign integrity of Ukraine and finds an off-ramp that's acceptable to NATO, to Ukraine, and to Russia.
Thank you for that. It might be that convoy might be some sort of cyber thing, or it might just be really lousy logistics, and we won't know, right? Ambassador Koenig, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. First, when I was first in Germany, I was a student there before I was a diplomat. We had a thing called Reforger. There were exercises made to sort of support the frontline defense of Europe in the case of a war. And we kind of began to dabble in that kind of stuff after 2015. We began to pay attention to lines of communication leading from Western Europe into Eastern Europe and so forth. We need to really redouble that. In addition to sort of stationing forces, we need to prepare for war in a way that we really didn't think we had to before. And I'm sorry in a way that we satisfied ourselves with these very small scale rotational deployments of sort of air policing units and so forth, and smaller units. But the reason we did was because of the political atmosphere in Europe at the time, and now that's been transformed. So I'm hoping that we can act more forcefully. We do need to find an off-ramp, I think. And I regret to kind of suspect that much more pain will be felt in Ukraine before we get there. I think Ukraine is confronted with horrific decisions. You look at a place like Mariupol, should that city surrender? I mean, these are the kinds of decisions that leaders need to make. I admire Zelensky for his heroic quality. I wonder sometimes, I'm beginning to worry about the fate of the Ukrainian population in a place like Mariupol. Much depends on his honest assessment of will his country be able to fight to the negotiating table. I hope so. That would be better for all of us, but I'm not sure. Humanitarian corridors, these kinds of things, we need to really focus on, not to dismiss any talks. All talks are good, I think. Communication is good, and hope that a solution is found on the battlefield, finding an off-ramp, rather than in the pulverization of Ukraine. I am very fearful on that score. Anyway, I don't really have much to add. I don't know that we can ever, it's going to be a long time before we recover from this episode. We might find a way ahead in things like arms control. You know, that is one way that we built trust with the Soviet Union back in that first Cold War that ended without the destruction of the planet. Thanks.
We can hope and pray, perhaps. Well, these are unsettling but important comments and insights for us to hear. So thank you both. I now want to turn to questions from our extraordinary World Affairs Council audience. And I want to start with my colleague, Julie Mueller. She is asking about Poland's proposal to send MiGs to Germany and then transfer them to Ukraine by way of the U.S. Is there a better way to help Ukraine? This seems like there's fraught with potential for escalation there. So let's see. Admiral Johnson, you want to take a first whack at that?
Sure. I think I've mentioned earlier, I don't think that a no-fly zone is a possibility. And I think we have to be very careful on the escalation path that we're on. I think we've gone about as far up that ladder as we can go. I think what we've done is prudent. We have complete unanimity within NATO. I understand why Poland wanted to take it through a U.S. base, and it's actually a German base, but it was one where we have to get our footprint on it. And I suspect the Germans have probably already told them no, so they wanted to see if we might join in on it. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think it's probably a good thing that it doesn't, because at the end of the day, we want this off ramp, and we're not going to get it if we go that route. We're going to get closer to World War III than we are to getting an off ramp in the immediate future, is my opinion.
Ambassador Koenig, do you agree?
I agree, and I would say this would really put huge stress, I think, on NATO unity, as Admiral Johnson pointed out. And in fact, in the end, as I understand it, the Polish, I think it was the Polish foreign minister, said last night that he understood that this would be a decision that would need to be taken by NATO. We're at the limit, I believe, of consensus engagement on the Ukraine issue in NATO. And we can't afford to undermine consensus in order to undertake, I think, more provocative action. I think that would be a disaster for all of us.
Just to, stomp on that again, I think the most powerful thing NATO has right now is the unanimity that it has. And we don't want to do anything that threatens that at this point. And that's also given the fact that we don't have a real strong actual military deterrent in place. That's the strongest deterrent, the strongest aspect of our current NATO deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, I think, in my opinion.
So speaking of putting stress on our NATO allies and NATO unity, a couple members have asked about the question of Sweden and Finland, not Norway. And, are they seriously considering applying for NATO membership, and what would the consequences be? But before the consequences of that application, is there any chance that 30 members will agree to admit Finland and Sweden at this particular point in time? And Ambassador Koenig, I'm going straight to you with this one.
I think that would be the easiest decision that NATO ever made, to be perfectly honest. NATO has been knocking on the door of Finland and Sweden for years now. And it's the Finns and the Swedes who have said, we're just not sure. It's been a long story. So I don't think there would be any resistance at all. Perhaps right now in this moment it would be sensitive, but I don't think that anybody would even consider for 2 seconds whether to admit Sweden and Finland as allies. They are practically allies in everything but being signatories of the Washington Treaty. Also, they kind of enjoy already. I don't think, by the way, that they're likely to move ahead at all quickly. This is this long story, and there's no strong indication that they're moving in that direction. They have a kind of backdoor security guarantee from NATO through the European Union Solidarity Clause, plus their very close relations. And finally, I would say, they have powerful militaries, and they have a strong deterrent capability on their own. So I think that Finland and Sweden are not threatened directly by this. They are very alert to threats coming from Russia, and they have significant deterrent capacity themselves.
I would strongly agree with John's comments. Finland has done remarkable things when it's gone to war with Russia, and Russia probably appreciates that fact as well as anybody. I think also, I've done an immense amount of work with both of those countries in a NATO context, exercises. Most of them are peace support kind of operations, but I've mentored several exercises in Sweden since I've retired. And I think it also, and so they're really joined at the hip with us in everything we do. And I also think that in some ways their independence is helpful. I don't think they do much without consulting with us and letting us know what's going on. And there are some of these, back channel means that we have, and I didn't mention them at the beginning when I mentioned back channel, but those are the president of Finland particularly comes to mind at this particular moment. So I'm assuming there's something going on there. I certainly hope so. He was recently in Washington, as you all know, and you must have heard him on the news at least one of the nights. So I think we're very happy. I think we should be glad that we have Sweden and Sweden and Finland where we have them, and that they're so valuable to the alliance, and they may even be more valuable not being members than they would be if they actually were. And the timing now, even if they were, is atrocious. We wouldn't do it right now anyway. So.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to the military side of things. So I'll stay with you, Admiral Johnson. Dakota Irving is asking whether you have a theory as to why the Russian military has, frankly, not done so well thus far. And there's a lot of commentary suggesting that the fundamental problem has been the nature of the mission and the political goals, and that a more conventional conflict with NATO forces would look different. What's up with the Potemkin military there? Any particular theories beyond?
Well, there's all kinds of things. I've been scratching my head on that myself. First of all, I think I find it hard to believe, but it could very well be that Mr. Putin really did totally misread what was going to happen. That he, in his 2 years of isolation during COVID, convinced himself that if he showed up in Kiev, that they would meet him with roses and cheers and hosannas, and all would be well. And I don't think he has a conscript army. They don't treat their people very well. They're not fighting Napoleon. They're not fighting Hitler. They're fighting fellow brother Slavs. They didn't sign up for this. I don't think they even knew they were going to do it, that they were actually going to be involved in combat. So that's one possibility. That he could have a lot of discipline problems. There could be mutiny going on. There's evidence of it. They've had some of the Russian soldiers on TV. They cover up their faces. They allegedly shoot holes in their gas tanks so the trucks can't move. They're on this road. They can't go left or right because it's all mud. It's springtime. They have no mobility. They've run out of fuel. I don't know. It could really be a totally Potemkin force. Who knows? It also could be that he was holding back because he intended to do other things. Once he got this done, he was going into the Baltics. I don't know, because he had a time where he, at least up until now, has had escalation dominance. And the amount of time with what we have in place in the Baltics wouldn't take very long to get to the Baltic Sea for him. There's no strategic space for those countries. And so I don't know what the answer is. It's a bit mystifying. And in time, we'll be able to figure it out. John might have some better ideas, but I read everything I can see, and I don't have a good answer for it. It's good news. It's good news for the Ukrainians, and I think it's good news for us.
The fog and friction there. Ambassador Koenig?
I don't really have anything to add. I thought that Rog did a good job on that. I don't. I think it has created hopefully some negotiating space so that the outcome can be better. I mean, despite the fact that it opens time for a lot of casualties and a lot of human lives to be destroyed and cities, it has created, I think, a chance that a outcome that preserves more Ukrainian sovereignty could be found.
Yeah, I'd just like to add in this discussion, just say for the sake of argument that it had gone the way Mr. Putin thought it would, and that they started this, on a Wednesday morning or a Thursday morning, and by Sunday, they had it locked up. What would we be doing right now? And again, they had that momentum, they had their escalation dominance, and what would have happened next. So we should be very, very thankful that what's happened has happened, and in due course, we'll find out why it did happen that way. But it's been extremely fortunate. You combine that with the newfound solidarity within NATO and now, so the calculations and the equations that Mr. Putin are looking at have changed profoundly since that Thursday morning when he started this whole operation.
We can hope. There's a couple specific questions about escalation and the potential for Russia to be entangled or engaged with specific NATO members. Specifically, Susan Welsh is asking about Russian spokesman General Konashenkov said yesterday that the Ukrainians sent fighter jets to Romanian air bases, so sort of to park them there during the conflict. And he said that if the jets come back to Ukraine, Russia will treat that as an act of war. Any thoughts on that, particular, because that's, the perfect example of that kind of accidental entanglement where you have the potential for this to really spin out of control.
Well, that's been a hypothetical. It's been mentioned many times. And, I don't know how good their command and control is, how closely they can track. They know some left. I think some left. I don't know how many. I don't think they're flying offensive. They would be defensive sorties to protect Ukrainian airspace from those bases. And if they did that, that would probably be pretty provocative. If it, in the middle of the night, if they flew at very low altitude and hop skipped the jump over from a Romanian base back to a Ukrainian base and then flew something, I don't think anybody probably would ever know that happened. As long as it's one of the original Ukrainian airplanes, not one that they can track that. They sold them that stuff, so they know who's got what.
If I could just step in, I don't think Russia is looking to expand this war by provoking NATO to invoke Article 5. I really don't. I think we are sadly locked in a kind of cauldron battle here, if you want to use that, where the Ukrainians are throwing all their forces and the Russians are throwing all their forces at each other. And the outside world is looking on, more or less. And that's probably the way the Russians want it. So I don't think they'll be looking for opportunities to provoke Article 5 situations. They could easily do that. That option is available to them. every day of the week.
So let's get to the question of a potential off-ramp, because we're going to hope that we get to the off-ramp, and we're going to hope we get there sooner rather than later, and that diplomacy bears fruit. Of course, one of the principles of negotiation is if you don't make a deal with yourself, you make a deal with the other guy. And Owen Trailer has asked here, in order to find that off-ramp for and with Putin, do we have a sufficient understanding of what is really important to him? What is he really after here? Is it that he wants to stop NATO enlargement? He wants guarantees that Ukraine will never go into NATO? Or is it, in fact, delusions or illusions of a greater Russia, or perhaps reestablishing the Soviet Union, or maybe even the Great Russian Empire? Ambassador Koenig, what do you think there? Do we really know what Putin wants?
Well, there are others who know better what Putin wants than I do. I would say Bill Burns is probably as well equipped to judge this as anybody in the US government. But I would say that my view is that he wants something more like Belarus. He wants a Ukraine that is more like Belarus. Look at what's happened to Belarus in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. Belarus has been, as a security entity, absorbed by Russia. And I think that this is, as this may be the realist coming out in me, I think this is understandable as a desire for a sphere of influence, and in this case, a very tightly controlled sphere of influence with regard to a couple of key former republics of the Soviet Union, which are important to Russia. It doesn't seem that this includes, let's say, a reassertion of very, very strong control over Central Asian republics. I don't think that his intention is to reincorporate the Baltic states into some kind of Soviet style empire. I think this is about Ukraine, and Ukraine is extremely important. And he's made that abundantly clear over a very long period of time that he thinks Ukraine is worth fighting for. And that's what he is doing now.
I would
Admiral
agree.
Johnson?
Yeah, I would agree with John. And that's when we do find some path towards some kind of off-ramp. These will be very delicate and important issues that are going to have to get negotiated. Just what we nod our head for, how we find some way to roll back sanctions. One idea that I read about today or heard someone talk about was escrow account, a huge escrow account, and let them continue to trade, but just put it all in an escrow account, and then use that as part of the negotiating as we start to, if we find this off ramp, and start opening that spigot back up and find some credible path to slowly back off on the sanctions. At the same time, you're going to get some kind of an agreement. We do not want Ukraine to be the next Belarus. So we're going to have to give up something. Maybe it's, something about some way to finesse the NATO membership issue, or things like that. We're going to have to negotiate that. And we, the United States, who push very hard on the sanctions, what have you, are probably going to have to find ways. I would not recommend doing it all at once. It's going to have to be over a process. But we want Ukraine to be a sovereign state that has its duly elected government, has the right of self-determination, and like I said, a Marshall Plan and all kinds of ways to help them economically. But we don't want them to be a Belarus.
I know that we don't want them to be a Belarus, but it's pretty clear that, that's probably what Putin is envisioning. And there's a question here from Charles Byron that I think sort of gets at the core of the realist dilemma here. Given what he's doing right now, I mean, his increasingly indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, which if Aleppo, Syria is any indication, is likely to get worse and worse and worse. What happens if Putin says, I don't want to invoke Article 5, but I will not accept that there is a democratic Ukraine, and continues to pulverize Ukraine? What then does NATO do, if anything? Ambassador?
Me for that one. The
I couldn't
First of
find my
all-
mute button.
first of all, I think, I mean, I don't mean to be callous, but I do not think that the Russian forces are conducting an indiscriminate, massive campaign to destroy civilian infrastructure and kill civilians now. I know that there are many, many civilian casualties and that they have struck civilian facilities, and they've struck civilian facilities that would ordinarily be regarded as unacceptable, as potentially war crimes if it was determined that they were done deliberately. But the casualty count is not enormous. I don't mean to make fun of this. I think maybe they are treating Ukraine differently from the way they treated Syria. Maybe their expectations about the Ukrainians are different from what they were with regard to the population in Syria. I don't know, but I would say there is a long way to go before I think we have a completely indiscriminate carpet bombing campaign of, let's say, Kharkiv to destroy the city completely. At that point, I don't know. I mean, surrender is an option for the cities that cannot be held. I think that's not an illegitimate option. It's not cowardice. It is maybe the only practical solution. I do not think we should. I don't think we are prepared to fight a war over the future of Ukraine. I honestly do not. That entails direct engagement with Moscow because of the risk of escalation and the fact that a wider war is likely to have even more victims. So I think it is a dilemma, but it's one that I wouldn't expect. I would hope that we could avoid.
Admiral Johnson, does it weaken NATO globally as we sort of sit back? I mean, if we get to the point where there's surrender, I mean, we do not want to go to war and risk the Third World War for the sake of Ukraine, but does that have an impact on NATO?
Well, I don't think it has any more impact on NATO than it does the rest of the world that calls itself democratic and freedom-loving nations, which are unfortunately in decline all over the world. And so it will reflect badly upon civilization, but I don't think it will reflect any more badly upon NATO than it does anybody else. I do regret that we hadn't had more foresight over the last 15 years, because we should have said "niet" a long, long time ago, a few times. But all the messages we gave, we just lost interest in all of this, and we weren't going to respond. And he could, even though he was holding a 7 and an 8 or whatever, no hand at all, he still felt he could play it, and he got away with it. And so this is very, very sad, but history is full of this. That doesn't make it any better. It's painful, but NATO doesn't have a treaty obligation to do that. And I don't think you would tear NATO apart. NATO will not do this, because NATO will come apart before this is sorted out. And then you'll have individual countries that will have to decide what it wants to do. So that's the cold, hard facts. I guess John and I are both in the realist camp, and that's part of being in that camp.
Is the dismal side of things. Yes, I know that feeling very well. Assuming that the world lives through this conflict, and this is the last question, what comes next, and specifically in terms of the security architecture for Europe, but also the globe? What is NATO going to have a more focused role? And if so, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Because, the international order has sort of been on life support for a while, and this really shakes those foundations. So what's after this? I'll start with Admiral Johnson, and then I'll give Ambassador Koenig the last word.
Well, I do think there'll have to be some rethinking of this. I don't think it makes a big difference in NATO, because I just don't think NATO will ever expand. I guess there's a remote possibility the two Balkan countries that are left that aren't part of NATO, I guess that would make us 32, but that isn't going to change any strategic balance vis-a-vis Russia. And so I think it should continue its mission. It should continue to work diligently and to maintain the common values that it currently has and the common view of the security picture as it sees it. I hope it teaches us a hard lesson about staying focused and how important it is to have credible deterrence, and that it's kind of democracy. You got to stay in that vineyard every day and prune those bushes and take care of it. And we didn't. And when you have a important neighbor like Russia, you're gonna have to pay attention to us. It's begs into question in the Pacific Rim. I think one of the biggest geostrategic blunders that has ever been made by this country is to pull out of TPP. And I don't know how we're going to put that back together, but it probably starts giving people in that region some thought about what kind of a coherent alliance structure might there be there. And then again, knowing what the red lines will be with our competitor out there, and thinking through this very, very carefully. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of Taiwan sitting out there. So I think we need to give some careful thought to all of this and how like-minded nations are going to take care of themselves. I do think also the relationship with China at this point, vis-a-vis Russia, we were kind of disappointed on the first day of the Olympics. But as it turns out, I think Russia may be, at the current situation that we have, a bit of a break on holding back a little bit on the options that Mr. Putin has, because if they were enthusiastically supporting what he was doing, that would strengthen his hand considerably.
Ambassador Koenig, over to you.
Yeah, I would agree with Admiral Johnson with regard to the outcome with regard to NATO. I just don't think NATO is going to be trying to transform itself into a more global organization the way it was earlier for any time soon. Its original purpose is adequate. It's more than enough for it to worry about. And I think if we could actually succeed in that purpose, we will have done everybody in the world a great favor, including ourselves. The larger question of security architecture, both in Europe and globally, I think it is time to start talking again. You know, we have not talked about this for ages. We shelved it kind of in the 1990s as being just too difficult. And then as our adversaries became more powerful, I think we were uncomfortable with the notion that we would have to make concessions. So we have not actually been very responsible world citizens in this regard. You could say that's partly true with regard to the TPP. I would say it's also true in many other areas of actual rules making. We stopped making rules after the 1990s. And you know, there were good ideas out there for how to inspire more rule making, and we lost interest very quickly. So if we are able to pick up the pieces after this thing, I think we should take a hard look at trying to create new rules that include our adversaries as well as our friends. Many of the challenges facing the world now, let's say climate change and pandemic disease and sort of disruptive technologies and all these things, really are more suitable for being addressed at a global level than they are in defensive blocks. And I am hopeful that maybe that will be a lesson that will arise from this tragic situation, but that may be a little bit too hopeful for a realist like me. But I hope so.
Yeah, I'd like to just add too, while we're at it, one of the things with organizations like the World Affairs Council of Maine and what have you, we should all work real hard to make sure we don't go into an isolationist phase. We should stay thoughtfully, responsibly engaged internationally. And so the extent that the World Affairs Council promotes this and advocates for this, we need to continue it. So all of you who are on here tonight, go out and find 5 more people that want to become members of the World Affairs Council of Maine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral Johnson, for doing your job as a member of our advisory board and giving a plug for our organization. But I could not agree more. When things like this in the world happen, you feel helpless. And this is actually something that every American citizen can do, and that is be informed, learn, understand, ask questions. And so I know I didn't get to every question tonight, but thank you to all of those who asked these fantastic questions. And Bill, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, I really do want to thank our two realists tonight. I really appreciate their perspective. That was really very, very interesting. And I think it contributed a lot to our understanding of the situation. I really appreciated how you took us through a kind of almost describe it as a timeline from the history, how we got to where we are now. What was the background for all that? And I think that was a very interesting discussion on your part. And your analysis of the current situation was certainly very helpful. And then I do appreciate your thoughts on, well, where do we go next? And I'm looking for the off ramp, just like you are, I'm sure. And that is certainly difficult, but it's obviously something we need to find. And the off ramp might be, as you mentioned, might be happening now through back channel diplomacy. We really don't know. But I also appreciate the fact that you're talking about going beyond this and talking about the future security architecture. And I think that's really something we need to do. And I think we lost interest in that, unfortunately. But what kind of a Europe, if I just confine it to Europe, what kind of a Europe do we want to build where we can all live together peacefully? So I think you contributed an enormous amount. I really appreciate the thoughts that you provided. And I think this has been a very interesting discussion. And for the World Affairs Council members of Maine, I think we certainly appreciate it because we know that what happens overseas is, we say Maine is globally connected, and it truly is, whether it could be for good or ill. And so I think your contribution tonight really helps us all out. And I do want to thank, of course, not only our realist speakers, but also our audience for the excellent questions. And as always, I always have to say this, sorry we didn't get to all your questions, because we never do. And I also want to thank our sponsors, which include, you can see the names right over there. We do appreciate the sponsors. They keep us funded to some degree and help continue the World Affairs Council programs. And we'll continue to follow events, obviously, in Ukraine and provide our members with forums to learn and to share and to think about, what can you do as an individual? Well, I think that's important. And that could be something that you can do to help maybe the Ukrainians, maybe to help promote public diplomacy, maybe to even vote. How are you going to vote? I think those are all important things we need to think about when we face issues like this. So we're also going to continue our regular programming, so beyond Ukraine. Next Wednesday night, we have a webinar on non-fungible tokens and the global art trade. Now that's going to be quite a change from what we did tonight, but I think you're going to find that absolutely fascinating and a chance to learn something new. And we are also going to be resuming our governor's breakfast. So that will be with Governor Janet Mills in cooperation with the Maine International Trade Center. And that will be coming up later this month. And I'm going to ask Allison, I've got two different possible dates for that breakfast. It's March 17 or March 24.
As I continue to have my habit of transposing numbers, it is March 27th, and you are correct.
All right, March 27. I think that's going to be very interesting. We'll hear from Governor Mills. We're very happy to be able to put that on again. So again, thank you very much for tonight. I think this was absolutely fascinating. I do hope we find a peaceable solution, and it needs to be done very, very quickly. And again, thank the audience for being here, and stay in touch with, as the Admiral says, stay in touch with the World Affairs Council of Maine. And thank you again, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. I'll be ending the webinar now. Good evening.